Welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Let's begin where we can't escape. Let's begin with Logos.
Now, I would say that this openness, this being in the world, this referring to the world, to objects in the world, what I would like to call self-transcendence, this is disappearing as soon as you project a human being into a lower dimension than its own dimension.
The point of the V goes up to the nuclear explosion that created it.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point.
Do not be afraid. Open your hearts, open up your hearts.
Open up your hearts to Athens and Jerusalem. The infants of our culture, united, independent, polarized, and even bloody. Athens, the cradle of wisdom and rationality. Jerusalem, the cradle of faith and spirituality. In this podcast, we look at reunion. Could reason be more than modern secular skepticism? And could spirituality be more than belief?
I just got an email from someone who's been. Can I just quickly read this?
Please.
It's not very short, but anyway, it's not that long either. It says, "Hi, Kamran. The ongoing conversation around faith and science is at the heart of your podcast. So I wanted to introduce you to Brian Cranley, who brings a fresh and approachable perspective to this topic. Brian's background includes a degree in biomedical engineering and a master's in philosophy and theology, making him uniquely positioned to speak to the harmony between scientific discovery and religious tradition. His new book, The Call of Wonder, guides readers through questions many people face. Can modern science and ancient faith coexist? Brian addresses this by examining how the mysteries of science, like the Big Bang and evolution, reveal the same wonders described in scripture and monotheistic faith traditions. He explores the philosophical and theological depth of reconciling faith with scientific inquiry and how real wonder fuels both spiritual growth and research. Brian's engaging style makes these complicated ideas welcoming. He passionately discusses the influences of Greek philosophy on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and he shares how scientific practice itself can become a spiritual pursuit. Your listeners who are passionate about both faith and inquiry will find his perspective thought-provoking and hopeful. Would you be open to considering him for Athens and Jerusalem? Thank you for your time, Rebecca Epstein." That sounds exciting, doesn't it? Do you know this person? Stephen, is he one of your
No, I
many
haven't come across
admirers?
him before. I'm checking him out right now. He has a great website, briancranley.com.
So here is someone we could very well invite to our next session. Sounds very interesting.
Yeah, and also the one who has actually given you the information, Rebecca Epstein, I guess also have thoughts on the topic. So maybe we should, give the opportunity to the listeners if they want to get in contact with us.
Absolutely. I think this is wonderful because it will also broaden I'm sure that this gentleman has his own sort of group of people that are in his network. So this way we can all connect. All people who are interested in this bringing together of Athens and Jerusalem, that we can, become a broader network and can interact more.
It strikes me hearing that, but then also looking briefly at the blurb around Brian Cranley's The Call of Wonder, but there's this long history of people doing in religion doing reason, and you can be very rigorous in your reasoning, as rigorous as you want, but everything depends on the premises you accept at the starting point.
Yes, exactly.
And in the case of what I'm imagining Brian Cranley just again, looking at the website and the book, you know, you can get out modern science very easily, nicely compatible with, say, the Bible at whatever level of resolution you want to read it, you know, literally, non-literally. You can get out whatever you want as long as you set your premises appropriately. So if you have if your starting point is a God who created the world and who intervenes in the world however he likes with particular intentions, then you get whatever you want. I mean, yeah, you get modern physics and you get evolution and all of that stuff because you know, because God is sort of in the mix, intervening in micro and macro ways, making sure that his will is done in the world. And in that case, science and reason become, yeah, they're still explanatory until they're not. You know, they're explanatory until that external causal agency, that God of the universe, wants to do something other than what the laws of physics say. And okay, so someone goes and walks on water or heals the blind or something, and God can do that. So there's no cognitive dissonance there. You know, it's a beautiful, rational, you know, scheme in which science and religion are perfectly harmonized. But what you have to swallow at the starting point is the premise of a particular kind of creator God who has, you know, consciousness writ large, much like our own, and who has agency much like our own, but of course vastly greater. And you're off to the races. You know, you've got your you know, your system that solved all the problems. And same with the Talmud. I mean, the Talmud and all of this, you know, thousands of years of religious debate and deep thinking and reasoning about, you know, the consequences of, you know, to religious law of certain passages in the Bible. All of that, you can be as reasonable as you want, but your conclusion is always going to be a result not so much of the reasoning, but of the starting point of, this is what we take our sacred scripture to be, this book, and this is how we understand the meanings encoded in that book, you know, out of which we have to extract them through this laborious process of reasoning. But the conclusion already sits in the premise, the conclusion to all of that reasoning, and you think that the reasoning is what got you there. You know, you're proud of the reasoning for having sort of produced this, you know, this great conclusion, or produced this consonance between science and religion. You think, wow, you know, yay reason. But really it should be yay premises, you know. It's like, because that's where it all was already in the beginning. And somehow people don't realize that. I mean, I think so much of the science religion debate is somehow ignorant of the premises that inform both sides of the debate, and the premises seem to be the problem, and they're the thing that's where the real disagreement lies, is in the premises.
The premises, and perhaps even the sort of rules of approach, if I want to call, because, for instance, I mean, science has certain rules, doesn't it? I mean, in terms of, for instance, that you go for the explanation that is the simplest, that is sort of, I would say, the thriftiest, right? So the question becomes that, yes, maybe we can fit God into the picture, but do we need to fit God into the picture? I mean, could this all be without a God? So you know, that there are these things that so I think, I mean, there's, of course, I think there's no total unity about what the scientific method really is, but I mean, I think there we have to also see whether it's applicable here, and I think it should be. I mean, because
I can hear
don't.
people like, you know, Dawkins saying, you know, we have a simpler, you know, we win on simplicity. We win on we scientists, you know, win on Occam's razor, because, you know, way back when people believed in all these gods, and then we thought it was this great leap forward to believe in one God, And then science comes along and says, hold on, we can get all of this, we can explain all of this by erasing that last God. And now we're down to 0 gods, which is even more simple.
Yeah.
But the problem that never gets answered is, how did this wonderful, recognize intelligible structure arise in the first place? And then you're left with this little niggling concern of, well, what about the Big Bang? How did the Big Bang start? And
Yeah.
And what gave the universe the structure that it has? What gave the electron its mass? What gave us 3 space dimensions and 1 time dimension? And these things which seem quite arbitrary according to our theories are left without an explanation. And that's just kind of swept under the rug as well. We'll figure that out. We'll figure that out anon. We'll figure that out in the course of time by applying this scientific process of reasoning that has done us so well up until now. Whereas those in the religion camp, the traditional religion camp, would say, no, ours is simpler because science has abandoned even asking the question about how things got here. Well, religion answers that question very simply. We have one very simple creator God who's one in essence, who's one in attributes, who is perfectly, and you can, using language as a kind of linguistic play, you can assign to that creation point the utmost simplicity. But you're kind of fooling yourself if you do that, because it's not a starting point of utmost simplicity. There's premises baked in that there is consciousness, there's desire, there's will of some sort, and that will has something to do with creating beings that in turn love and are conscious and so forth. And so there's a great deal of complexity that you already have to bake into your premise. So, but then the present day debate in science and religion thinks, well, it's between these 2 ways of thinking. These are our choices. You either have a religion that has no, let's say, purpose or God or telos baked into it, and that kind of universe is going to be the materialistic universe of science, and your only other option is, well, you have some sort of purpose which comes from outside, and that outside purpose is, you could call it the uncaused cause of Aristotle, like the ancient Greeks did, or you could fold that into Christian theology and say that uncaused cause is the Christian God, and then you've got presto, you've got your purpose, but that purpose had to come from a premise, which is there's some creator God who built all this purpose into our universe. Maybe there's a third option, and maybe that third option is that purpose is self-emergent.
How?
How could purpose be self-emergent? Well, how does, if you imagine the universe not on a line, like there's a Big Bang event which you have to explain, and then there's this linear progression of time. But if you just join the starting point and the end point, then you have a universe that could in some way generate itself. How does it generate itself? We could take a stab and say, through consciousness. And we can sort of, this is our own, a narrative of our own devising. This is not a scientific theory, but at least it has the virtue of explaining sort of how purpose comes into being on the one hand, and on the other hand, doesn't require that purpose to be an external causal agent. It seems to be the next logical possibility, is that the causal agency behind the universe is the universe thinking itself into being, dreaming itself into being. And immediately you have, I think, a lot of conversations you can have both on a hard science side and on the side of religion and spirituality. On the hard science side, you have the weirdness of quantum mechanics, that somehow a system exists in a state of potentiality until an observation is made. And there's endless debate about what is the nature of this observation? What gets to do the observation that resolves this potentiality into actuality? And there are and there's plenty of play for pseudoscience and weird ideas and magical thinking about consciousness being able to, but at the same time, I think there is truly a mystery here that hasn't been solved. And that mystery has something to do with the nature of consciousness and something to do with how consciousness interacts in the world. So on the one side, you have this, and then on the other side, you have all sorts of religious traditions that talk about an originating principle, which is somehow self-reflective. The logos principle of the ancient Greeks becomes manifest in Christian theology as something which is undergirds the world, which is in some way that causative element, but which is at the same time within the world. It becomes manifest, it becomes flesh, it dwells amongst us, this logos principle. So it is somehow both the alpha and the omega. It's there at the beginning and it's there at the end. You have, going farther east, you have the universe as the dream of Maya. The Brahman dreams the world into existence, and we're that eternal, eternal dream of something. And these, I think, also suggest to us a universe in which consciousness is centered, not a universe in which consciousness is some sort of accidental outcome of a process of billions of years of evolution, which could just as well not have been here. From this perspective, consciousness is the necessary boundary condition for the existence of the universe itself. Yes.
No, I think this is very interesting, and because I often think that if we have any attempt to actually argue for religion or for this connection between the religiosity and science, then we often end up with premises.
Mm-hmm.
That it's very difficult for us to start to have an argumentation without having like a linear argumentation with a beginning, with premises, like axiomatic premises, and then develop the argumentation from there on. But what you are arguing, Stephen, is that there should be some kind of different kind of argumentation, which gives a different way of logical thinking. And this is what you are, in my opinion, this is what you are trying to explain for us now.
Yes, although I'm not suggesting, bringing in a different kind of logic, I'm suggesting a different set of premises. A premise which is the same as the conclusion, or it's like, I'm suggesting a world which is kind of like when you go to the park and you have these soap bubbles that you can blow, that are these enormous things that are as big as your head, or 3 times as big as your head, and they're floating in the air, and they're vibrating and undulating, and they have all sorts of modes of being and shapes that can stretch and pull. But there's something that keeps it a soap bubble. There's a boundary around it that defines that soap bubble. But within the constraint of that boundary, it can take many different shapes. Maybe the universe is sort of like a soap bubble in that sense. There's a boundary condition, and within that boundary condition, there are all sorts of shapes that it can take. Well, what is that boundary condition? The boundary condition is consciousness. At some point, the universe has to evolve consciousness in order to exist. And one can then say that consciousness is both the alpha and the omega of such a universe. It's the thing that is somehow brought it into being, but at the same time, it's the thing that emerges through natural processes, Darwinian processes, if you like, that emerges at the end. I'm taking a lot of inspiration here from John Wheeler's famous U diagram, where he imagines the role of quantum mechanics in cosmology, and that our observations of distant quasars are not just passive observations, but are somehow implicated in the nature of the universe, going all the way back to the creation point. And it was his intuition, purely thinking it through scientifically, not thinking it through, at least consciously, with any kind of religious biases, but purely as a secular scientist, saying, hold on, maybe consciousness is not just the tail end of an accidental process here on this planet, but maybe it's implicated in some way. And other scientists after him have sort of taken that and tried to run with that idea of the implicate nature of consciousness. And David Bohm is one, and others with greater or lesser success. It's one has to confess it's not a mainstream idea, in science today or in cosmology. Although I think one can look at what Stephen Hawking and Hartle were doing in the 60s and 70s, was kind of similar. They were also looking at that origin point of the Big Bang and asking, hold on, is this really a beginning point, or is there no boundary here? So they had a proposal that maybe the universe is not boundaried in time, but maybe there's a way of thinking about the overall structure, which opens up the possibility of universes which are more cyclical in their structure rather than linear in their structure. And so there's a subset in cosmology of people looking at cyclical universes as one possibility. And this idea would fit very neatly within the boundaries of a cyclical universe, which really just has one cycle. And that one cycle is a cycle in which somehow the beginning and the end point are the same. And that at the same time opens up the possibility that there's an infinite number of ways that consciousness can think itself into being or observe itself into being. It opens up the possibility that we live in a multiverse, just as it's been supposed through other means, through just looking at the structure of inflation theory and the possibility that our whole universe is just the result of a bubble nucleation event, and maybe there are parallel universes with slightly different settings, slightly different laws of nature, or different settings of the strengths of fields and masses of particles and so forth, that somehow live in parallel with each other. This would suggest that maybe there's a multiverse of consciousness. Maybe there's an infinite number of consciousnesses all thinking themselves into being, which would explain, I use explain in quotation marks, which would explain why our universe seems to be arbitrary in certain ways. The structure of our universe has so much arbitrariness to it. There's been, over the decades, over the past century, so much effort put into trying to explain, and Einstein was one of the biggest proponents of this, trying to explain how the universe as it presently exists is the only way it could have existed. The only way that you could have, a self-consistent set of equations with all of the bells and whistles that we observe. But more and more, I think there's almost a capitulation to the fact that we live in a universe which is in many ways arbitrary, which has asymmetries baked into them. There's why are neutrinos only one-handed? Why do we have CP violation? There are beautiful symmetries underlying laws of physics, but at the same time there are asymmetries, they're broken symmetries. Why are some symmetries broken and other symmetries are not broken? That seems to me to be an element of arbitrariness. Well, why would there be arbitrariness? One explanation for that is that maybe there are other universes which have different sorts of broken symmetries, and they also produce consciousness. I'm spinning out a wild theory here, and I'm waiting for you all to push back and say this is nonsense.
Now, just some comments. I think for me, a lot of what you're saying makes sense. I don't know enough in cosmology to really to understand everything, but especially also that when we are talking now, to be able to talk about these and to have arguments, we need consciousness. So we need to take part in some kind of consciousness, and also together to be able to understand each other. And I think that's extremely important if we are to believe in consciousness at both the beginning and the end. But then, because what started this discussion was Brian Cranley, which none of us have read. We didn't know about him before Cameron's email he got. And I think it's important that it might be more to his argumentation than we know, and it also but what we read, with the first thing you're reading, then the premise of God is like the first premise he uses, but that doesn't mean that this is all in his book. So I think that's important to say, and also to remember that. And I really hope that maybe we could have him on the podcast to discuss his argumentation.
And I personally like this idea of, like there are premises and then there is a method. And I don't know if this is oversimplifying it, but I think maybe we could say that from religion we can get premises, from science we can get the scientific method. Maybe if we put them together, we end up somewhere where the two can complement each other.
Well,
Because there
science has its own
definitely isn't
premises.
any religious method that
Yeah.
that I'm aware of that we could, compare with the scientific method.
Science is not without its own premises.
Pardon
One
me?
of which is the regularity of the laws of nature, is I
Mm.
think a premise, and which isn't to say, oh well, it's all, everyone has their premises, so every theory is equal to every other theory. That's something you often see happen in the science religion debate as well. It's like, oh well, it's all based on faith. Science is based on faith. Religion is based on faith. So, and
Yeah, I think perhaps in my mind, the main contribution of religion to this particular aspect of things is that religion suggests that there is a purpose to existence. However, otherwise we can sort of map it out and so forth. But that eventually all of these different mechanisms and this reality has a purpose to it. That there's some sort of a supreme will. Now, to me that is sort of like the main premise here that one could sort of study, because I think science does not necessitate such a premise.
exactly, which is exactly the core motive that leads me to look for this third option, in which the premise is also purpose, but not
Yes.
the external purpose of a creator God, which then just becomes a turtles all the way down sort of thing. Well, what created that God? How do you explain, how that God got there with all of his will and intention for the universe and so forth? Instead, if the purpose is somehow emergent, baked in a sort of alpha equals omega sort of sense, then yes, we live in a world which is infused with purpose, a world in which consciousness is the centerpiece in a way, but at the same time, a world in which, because when you zoom in on a circle, any piece of a circle looks like a line, and here we are zoomed into the world in which we live, seeing historically a few thousand years, into the past. We're really on the zoomed in. We can say the way we think about purposes is different. A purpose to us, this infused purpose, this purpose which is found within every atom, which is something which seems to emerge through billions of years of evolution. It's easy for us to argue that purpose is something external, because when you're zoomed into the circle and the arc of the circle looks like a line segment, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the alpha is the omega. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that purpose, which seems to be external, is really internal. That we're really generating it. I like this in part because the other two options give us a kind of dilemma, us human beings in the world. Either we live in a world which has no purpose, in which case, good luck. The best you can do is pick up your French existentialism and like generate your own personal purpose in a meaningless void of a universe. Or The other option being, well, purpose came when I was born and it was already there. And that purpose was, a religion, a sacred book with laws, with do's and don'ts and so forth that I had nothing to do with, that it's my duty simply to follow. And whether I follow or not ultimately doesn't matter to that purpose. It's all because it's external to me. But in the third case, purpose is something, the purpose of the universe is something which is somehow both within me and without me. In other words, it's something that I have a role in generating by virtue of being a conscious agent in the world that can create, that can join up with link up with other consciousnesses, that can create something like be a part of an ever advancing civilization. That gives me a role which is not an incidental role and which is not a passive role in the emergence and generation of that purpose.
Yeah. I also like that idea, and I think that's the beauty of existence, is that in a way existence is a participatory game. If you see it's, like, it's not like something or someone creates and the other is just sort of passively, but if there is some sort of a superhuman will and power that is referred to as God, then definitely yes, we are sort of, he has chosen us to be sort of his co-creators, or that I mean, this has been expressed in different. I mean, for instance, in the Quran, it says that, like, the way I think this has been put is that it says that every uh, nation, or not nation, every group of people can fulfill their destiny only by to the exercise of their own will. So there is this potential for us, and there's this potential in existence, and for that potential to be realized, and to what extent it is realized, depends on how we use our free will, and how we live our lives, and how we discern the purpose.
There's a phrase in the Quran that says, "We will show them our signs, fil afaq wa fil anfus," in the horizons and within their own selves.
Yes.
There's both an external. There's a way of relating to the divine as something external to us, and there's a way of relating to the divine as something internal to us.
Exactly.
And if you pick one and say the other, and try to nullify the other, you're doing violence to the nature of the world, which is that the outer and the inner are co-creators. The outer and the inner are parts of an interwoven fabric, and you can't just say that there's an outer and no inner, or that there's inner and no outer. But and this gives us a kind of agency that otherwise we wouldn't have. Otherwise, we would just be either motes floating blindly on a infinite sea of nothingness, or we're soldiers in an army in which we had no choice whether to enlist or not. In either case, we fundamentally don't have agency. But in this third case, we have fundamental agency, because we're co-building our own story, and our own story is actually creative. It's actually generative. In that sense, these stories, and I think I might have mentioned this in one of our previous discussions, like the story of Genesis, you can read that out externally as being a kind of history of how the world came into being in 6 days, and on day 1 this happened, on day 2 that happened, and then even try to pinpoint the years that it happened. Or you can say, yes, Genesis, the book of Genesis, was a creation event, but not a creation event in the passive sense of describing something that happened in the past, but in the active sense that those who enter into this story and who allow their lives to be shaped by this story, and who come into association with others who are similarly being shaped by this story and the premises that it represents, actually generates the civilization. It actually generates the world that we inhabit. In that sense, these stories of sacred scriptures past are, that's what's the difference between just a story that someone just invents and sells for $3.50 on the paperback shelf, and a sacred story which is fundamentally generative in the, we could call it sacred fiction or sacred narrative. It's something that by entering into and being a part of, and then by aligning your life in some way with the thing in all the infinite ways that one can do it, one becomes the participator in a cosmically creative process. And there's so much at stake. There's something at stake for us also collectively, because we can, failure becomes an option. And that's something that I think when the cause is something outside yourself, then you can say, well, we do it or we don't do it. Success is already assured. But when you're the agent, when you're part of the agency that's doing it, failure now becomes an option, and it now becomes meaningful. Your life actually becomes meaningful.
If I may refer to one of my favorite analogies, which that's of an orchestra, I think, I mean, it's a similar kind of a thing, that the composition, although it is a reality, and it can, I mean, I guess musical people can just look at the notes and sort of like enjoy it, but ultimately it becomes a reality when an orchestra plays it out, and that playing out of the composition is part of that creative process, isn't it? And in fact, different conductors, when you listen to the recordings of the same symphony by different conductors, they sound slightly different because you can interpret that same composition in multiple ways, and so it becomes a unique creation of yours.
It's such a perfect analogy, because there are infinite number of symphonies too.
Yeah, exactly.
And also it's a perfect analogy for a second reason, and that is the point of the symphony is the listening to it and the participating in it.
Exactly. Yes, you have the doubles.
It's not getting to the end of the symphony. The point is, and that's where music is such a wonderful analogy.
Exactly.
To the spiritual path.
Yeah, it is. Yes.
It's not about getting to the end of the piece, but it's about the playing of the piece and the.
Yes, and you have, as a musician, you have the double function, don't you, of being the player and the listener,
right,
at the same time. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a great analogy for that third reason, is that it begs this question about, are you a member of the orchestra,
yes,
or the jazz band, which may even be nicer, or are you a passive listener? Are any of us passive listeners to the music of life?
Yeah, that's a nice question. I like that. Okay.
Yes, I would also say that it's very important, this understanding that we are not a spectator to life, but we are actually participants.
Fantastic.
And
yes, exactly.
I think that's
exactly.
yeah. I guess I've said this before, and of course in the history of philosophy, Heidegger and Brentano and Husserl was maybe the first one to make this as a big point and to like a ground premise of their argumentation. But I think Stephen also tried to show us how this is not like it's not a premise that we are able to discuss, to choose that we are a participant or we are a spectator. I mean, to me, it's only one possibility, and that is that we are actually being part of this. We are participants in reality, in life.
Yes.
I don't know if there's more to say. We have, we had a discussion now, or maybe we have like Stephen have tried to give us a third point on understanding of how we could actually argument. How could we write a book as Brian Cranley has done, or how could we have a podcast and try to actually to argument? Because I think it could also be a fourth possibility, and that is to try to accept or to know this connection between religious science and whatever without argumentation. And then what is the possibility of that? What could we? I mean, is it all about action? Is it about rituals? Is it? I mean, is there a possibility that we could this tacit, could there be like a tacit knowledge which could actually bring us even closer to understand the connection? I got an old quotation from Anders Wuller. In 1947, he says something like, when the difference between Athens and Jerusalem is that in the perspective of Athens, the idea is that humans should know oneself. But in the Jerusalem idea, you are supposed to forget yourself. And then, okay, could that be that in to know yourself, you have to have like an argumentation? I'm not sure. Maybe you could say that you know yourself best when you do action and just are doing something, but also, but yeah. So maybe there's no connection between this. But anyway, is it true? Is this dichotomy correct? Is to believe in God or to believe in a religious, to be occupied by religious action, is that a way to forget yourself?
I think that's a brilliant question, and whether that is actually in it, whether knowing yourself and forgetting yourself are somehow mutually exclusive. I would rather say that one is the outcome of the other. I mean that you know yourself in order to be, or that knowing yourself leads to the realization that you are not the at least as a particular individual, are not the sort of the center of the universe.
Maybe we're tripping over the limits of language in it, because knowing yourself, it's a capital S self, but forgetting yourself is the lowercase self. I mean, is the referent to the word self in those two
self, exactly,
maybe different. I mean, I mean, other traditions have a notion of there being a higher self and a lower self, and it's the lower self we need to forget. That's our animalistic nature, all that comes along with that, instinctual likes and dislikes, and our ego. Whereas the higher self, the capital S self, is the self of God, and knowing that in knowing that self, one becomes one with that creative purpose of self generation. In that sense, the drop unites with the sea, and so on and so forth. But I think it's a really important point. Is there a fourth way? Is there a fifth way? Because that begs the question, which is, throughout the whole history of philosophical thought, so many different proposals have been thrown out. The universe is this way. No, it's this way. There's a cause. No, there's no cause. The purpose, and somehow, despite many clever people thinking up these questions and thinking up different answers to these questions over the thousands of years that we have record of these questions being asked and answered, like there have been no answers have been forthcoming that everyone can agree on. And so we're left with a seemingly irreparable state of affairs in which we just have schools of thought, and these schools of thought arise from just different natures of people's intellects. Some people naturally think in terms of very analytical terms, and some people just want to dance the dance, and they're not thinking it through at all. They're just taking life one day at a time. And other people are very rational, but they're coming to very different conclusions than these other very rational people. And so what do we do with that state of affairs? Is this a problem to be solved? In other words, are we going to have the hubris of imagining that, well, if we can just think our way to a better model, like a circular model and not a linear model or something, like I was talking about earlier, do we have the hubris to imagine that if a clever enough person just comes along with the right model, that everyone is going to say, oh yeah, that's the right one, and then suddenly all of humanity sort of gloms together into one shared idea about how the universe is? Do we really imagine that's the future for us, or is the future going to continue to be a patchwork quilt of different people thinking different things, and there being a dynamic interplay and tension between these different ways of thinking? Some people are always going to think, for example, along very atheistic lines and just say, look, I don't see purpose. You all are talking about purpose. I'm seeing these equations that allow me to predict with near infinite precision what's going to happen next, and I don't see purpose in those equations. And other people are going to say, look, without purpose, I can't live my life. And so one way or another, I'm gonna land on purpose, whatever the premises. And maybe that's just the human condition, that there's an innate and irreducible diversity to the human condition that we're going to just have to find a way to live within. And the problem of that is it manifests in different huge tribal groupings that we call religions, and nations, and cultures, and so forth. And when they start interacting at the boundaries, we get conflict. So how do we resolve the conflict between these seemingly irreconcilable ways of thinking about the world? Maybe that's the challenge, and not the challenge of creating some uber philosophy that we naively imagine everyone's just going to hitch their wagon to. Maybe the problem is more having a meta perspective in which we understand that diversity is a feature, not a bug. That somehow diversity is something to be celebrated and not something to be suppressed. And diversity in all the forms that it takes, not just the minor sorts of diversities that are really easy to celebrate, like regional cuisines and so forth. I mean, there are trivial diversities which are great, and everyone can agree that those are great. And then there's the real diversities, diversities of how people think about the world in very fundamental terms. Is there a way, is there an overarching, I don't know, a meta philosophy that can accept these diversities on their own terms and say, look, these variations in philosophies, which lead to Platonism and Aristotelian and realism and nominalism and things like that have thousands year-long ancient roots, to allow them to continue, because there's always going to be people who tilt towards realist positions and people who tilt towards nominalist positions, for example. There'll always be atheists among us, and there'll always be polytheists among us, as well as theists and everything in between.
But I think also part of this movement of appreciation of diversity and in fact benefiting from it is this getting rid of false dichotomies. Now, I think one, especially since we are now in our podcast, we have tried to somehow relate this issue of Athens and Jerusalem also most particularly to education. And I think there is a sort of a false dichotomization or false conceptualization very fundamental in education, which somehow sees how to say knowledge and the lack of it as opposites, and that would seem like to be quite obvious, that the more knowledge you have, the less lack of it you have, and sort of I think there's this false idea that somehow knowledge is something that at the end you can have all of it. But of course, I mean, I think this is something that Einstein especially liked to emphasize, that really the more you know, the more you realize how little you know. So knowledge actually leads to wonderment, true knowledge. And wonderment is when you realize that there's so much you don't know. So knowing and not knowing are not opposites, but they are rather complementary. And I think that this is something also where maybe essentially Athens and Jerusalem are complementary, because I think one is more typically oriented towards finding out, and the other one is oriented towards just wondering about how immense and majestic and beautiful and complex everything is.
But the original Athenian in this conversation, Socrates, when the oracle said he was the wisest man in Athens, or was it all of Greece, he knew how it was that he was the wisest, and it's because he knew that he didn't know. So
Yeah.
even in the in the roots of the Athens tradition, that we would like to trace, through some unbroken line to the modern scientific mindset, you have this beginning note of complete humility, of knowing that you don't know is really the beginning of wisdom. And in that sense, it dovetails beautifully with the greatest insights of the religious mystics about the absolute unknowing in the face of what we take to be the truth, or the real, or the good.
Yeah, but in our educational systems, we're unfortunately going exactly the opposite way. Now by sort of quantification of and quantified measurement of knowledge, PISA tables and things like that, they lead to a very sort of, I think, simplistic and monodimensional idea of knowledge, and also the fact that the more you have knowledge, the better, and there's definitely no room for any wonderment or anything like that, and you're measured according to how much knowledge you have, as it were, gathered, and this what Paulo Freire called the sort of banking concept of knowledge and education. So I think we are unfortunately down the wrong path, and I think this is where bringing together Athens and Jerusalem would make such a big difference in our educational system, where we would help young people or human beings general not only to have knowledge, but that this knowledge would then lead to just this amazement and wonderment, and just enjoying the greatness of everything that we are a small part of, instead of us trying to put everything under our microscope and say, we have control over all of this.
But also, Cameron, I just wonder if there is one of the premise on this idea that we get more and more knowledge, or that we are becoming more and more wise, or what we should call it. That there is a story. There's a linear story also in this perspective, and the story goes from mythos to logos. That we, in some way, they believe that we started in mythology, and then we have become more and more logical, and especially Socrates was this big change in this perspective, and I don't buy it. And some of the, because if you read old religious understanding of the priest, for instance, then the priest was the one who, like in the Egypt or ancient Egypt, then they were the one who were able to understand when the flood would come. That means they had the real knowledge, the knowledge about the future, and also mathematical knowledge, and they were able to write, which also gave them a mysterious power. And all these small, I guess, all these small logical ideas was more or less the beginning of religious activity, and a huge discussion. I mean, the huge questions about what is reality, what is all these, I guess, came afterwards, which means that the ground premise is younger than the first knowledge of what reality, what exists in reality. And I think it's extremely important to understand this, because if it believe that there's like going from mythos to logos, then we just end up in this story that we become more and more rational. But I think we are in the same way as Stephen talks about circles. I think we also, in our way of thinking knowledge, we are in this circle, and when you discuss this difference between not knowing that you know and knowing that you don't know, you in many ways you end up in the end and in the beginning at the same time, and I think that's also why I like to think more dialectical, and also dialectical not in the like in the end state, but in a linear end state, but more in a circle way. I think that that's a better way of trying to understand reality, to have a real orientation about what reality is.
Wonderful. That's a great conclusion, I think, for our conversation.
Yeah, it's been a joy just listening to you and to listen to Steve especially. And it's so funny that we it's not that often sometimes we have a more a topic to discuss, but today we didn't have. Actually, we just had a mail from Rebecca Epstein, was it?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, that's right.
And then we ended up in
that
this
triggered up
conversation.
this whole 1 hour conversation. Yes, thank you so much, Rebecca.
You have been listening to Athens and Jerusalem, created by Cameron Namdar, Stephen Phelps, and Knut Ove Essay. Nora Juel is the broadcast voice and technical support. Music is pieces of Edvard Grieg's Morning Mood. The voices in the intro are Viktor Frankl, interview with Robert Oppenheimer, and Pope John Paul II. Thank you for listening, and please check out another episode.